Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending the third lecture of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the 60th anniversary come the 35th Zhenmu Lecture in History and Culture of New Asia College. Today's lecture is jointly organized by the Hong Kong Public Libraries, Department of Chinese Language and Literature of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and the New Asia College. To enhance academic and cultural exchanges, the New Asia College of the Chinese University of Hong Kong has been organizing the Zhenmu Lecture in History and Culture since 1978. Every year, a distinguished scholar will be invited to deliver a series of public lectures, exploring topics on Chinese history and culture. This year, we have great honor to have invited Professor Martin Kern, Professor in Asian Studies, Princeton University. Today, Professor Kern is going to give us a talk on the Shijing in the warring states, evidence from newly discovered manuscripts. We are also very delighted to have Professor Chen Kam-siu, Department of Chinese Language and Literature of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to be the moderator of this lecture. So, without further delay, I will now pass over to Professor Zheng to introduce the speaker and start the lecture today. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and colleagues, good afternoon. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the Zhenmu Lectures in History and Culture. Today, we have the honor of hosting Professor Martin Kern from Princeton University, who will be delivering the third lecture in this esteemed series. Professor Kern is the Sedgwick Professor in Asian Studies at Princeton University. With a wealth of knowledge and expertise in the field of Chinese literature, history, and culture, Professor Kern has made significant contribution to our understanding of Asian Chinese texts and their historical context. Professor Kern is also a pioneer in comparative antiquity. He is the founding director of the International Center for the Study of Asian Text Cultures, 古代文本文化国际研究中心 at Renmin University of China. His impactful and interdisciplinary works have earned him a well-deserved reputation as a leading authority in the field. Today, Professor Kern is going to give us a lecture titled The Shijing in the Warring States, Evidence from Newly Discovered Manuscripts. 战国时期的诗经以新出土文献的证据谈起. This captivating topic promises to cast new light on the ancient Chinese classics, the Shijing, or the Book of Poetry, and its significance during the period of the Warring States. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm round of applause and welcoming to Professor Kern. Professor Kern, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhang, and thank you all for coming. I say the same thing that I said already twice in the two earlier lectures. This is a great honor to be here, to speak to you all, to be invited for this wonderful lecture series. And it was yesterday, as a matter of fact, when Professor Chan, where is he? I don't see him. He was just here. Took me around New Asia College and showed me, there you are. Why didn't I see you? And showed me not only the great heritage of Zhenmu, but also the great heritage of Yuyingshi at New Asia College. And I was very fortunate when I just started working at Princeton, that Professor Yu was still there for 1 year before he retired. And we were office neighbors, almost direct office neighbors. There was only one office between us, which was the old office of Albert Einstein, which was occupied by another colleague. But anyway, so I have only the fondest memory of Professor Yu. I've met him many, many times, of course, in Princeton. And it was such a pleasure to see how present he is at New Asia College. So thank you. All right, today we talk about 出土文献. And this is a complicated topic. It's not a simple topic. I try to make it understandable. But if there are things that seem difficult, I hope that you will not hesitate to ask me for clarification in the Q&A. I understand we have about 2 hours time, so this is very generous time, and we can go slowly to our materials. Okay, and as always, I have a manuscript here that I will mostly read. So, since the early Western Han aristocratic tombs at Mawangdui in Changsha in 1973, a series of ancient manuscripts, in one way or another related to the Shijing, have appeared either through archaeological excavations or stolen, looted from ancient tombs. At Mawangdui, a silk manuscript was found containing a text that modern scholars have titled Wuxing, or 5 modes of conduct. And what I show you here is simply one of the Mawangdui manuscripts. It's such a beautiful image that I chose this one. This, I believe, is not the Wuxing manuscript, but it looks exactly the same. This text, focused on moral self-cultivation, discusses selected lines from altogether 7 poems in the Shijing, and most importantly, Guanju, the very first of the Shijing, and the most important poem, I think, in the history of ancient Chinese literature. It advances, the Wuxing text, it advances an interpretation of Guanju that nobody had ever seen before. In 1977, more than 170 bamboo fragments, many of them very small, sometimes only containing 1 or 2 characters, were found in another aristocratic early Han tomb, this one at Shuanggudui in Fuyang in Anhui province. These fragments contain bits and pieces from altogether 65 Guofeng poems, and a very small number of Xiaoya fragments from altogether 4 poems of the Luming section in the Shijing. That's the first section of the Xiaoya part, Luming. All 15 Guofeng sections, so every Guo in Guofeng is there, except the Guifeng. So 14 of the 15 have material in the Fuyang manuscript from 165 BCE. More recently, a complete Shijing bamboo manuscript has been found in the tomb of Hai Hunhou, the mid-Western Han Emperor Liu He, who had been quickly deposed for his poor behavior after just 27 days as emperor. This tomb is located at Nanchang in Jiangxi, and the manuscript has been known for several years already, but it is still unpublished and therefore remains difficult to evaluate in detail. This is then the entire Han 6 dynasties and Tang manuscript evidence for the Shijing that we have up to the Dunhuang texts. Now, what about the Warring States? And here I'm giving you this table which gives you all the manuscripts that we have that have something to do with the Shijing. But one thing you need to know is that in early Chinese texts, no other text is quoted as often as the Shijing. It is clearly the single most important text. And not only is that true for our received literature, where we find the Shijing in texts like Zhuan, Xunzi, Mengzi, Li Ji, and so on, and so on, and so on. But it is also true for our excavated manuscripts of the last 50 years. No other traditional text appears as often as the Shijing in one form or another. And I will talk about the different forms. And you see here what is below this line. These are the three Han Dynasty, Western Han texts that I just mentioned. So Ma Wangdui, Fuyang, and Nanchang. Above the line are all the Warring States manuscripts that we know. And this is what I will focus on today. So we look at Jingmen Guodian, and then there were two manuscripts in Guodian that have Shijing materials. Then Shanghai Boguan has also two. One of these, here the Ziyi, is parallel to this Ziyi. And this is a looted manuscript, not archaeologically excavated, so we don't know where it's from. The same is true for the Tsinghua University manuscripts, also looted. And the same is true for Anhui Daxue manuscripts, also looted. This is a disaster for our field. It's an absolute disaster that this is happening in China. But we have been extremely fortunate that just recently, two manuscripts have been found by archaeologists. One in Jingzhou at Xiajiatai. This is very short. I will talk about this. And then Wangjiazui, which is a very long manuscript. And so these are the things I will talk about. Yeah. Especially I will talk about Tsinghua, Anhui, Wangjiazui, and Guodian. Okay. So let's look at Warring States. This is how a bamboo manuscript looks like. I'm not sure everybody has seen such images, so I thought I'd show you one. This is actually the Laozi Laozi material from Guodian, which is about 300 BCE. Now, in 1993, archaeologists discovered this tomb at Guodian, and it is a very small tomb. It was all robbers had left behind a bundle of bamboo slips, like this, that turned out to include a series of philosophical writings, including an earlier Wuxing version. So we already knew one, Wuxing from Ma Wangdui, and now we have a second one, an earlier one from Guodian. And then a text that matches the Li Ji chapter, Ziyi, or black robes. So the robbers had made a mistake, leaving the bamboo slips behind. But they learned very quickly. Since then, a large number of bamboo manuscripts were looted and then sold. Where? On the Hong Kong antiquities market. At ever higher prices. So the prices double with every manuscript. Some, but perhaps not all, of these manuscripts were then bought by or donated to the Shanghai Museum, the Yuelu Academy in Changsha, Tsinghua University in Beijing, Peking University, Anhui University, and so on. This is, of course, highly problematic. There are legal problems, including conventions that the UNESCO, the cultural organization of the United Nations, had proposed earlier, and that had been signed by some of these institutions, that they don't engage in obtaining stolen goods. And so while the Shanghai Museum, which was, and the Yuelu Academy, while they bought their manuscripts fairly early and still reasonably cheaply, all the others, Beida, Tsinghua, Anhui, could not buy. They could only have the manuscripts kindly donated to them by their respective xiaoyou. This is the way how you get around the UNESCO. Now, when you look at this illustrious group of institutions, you realize, and when you go back to this list here of places where something has been, Jingmen, Jingzhou, Changsha, Fuyang, Nanchang. There is no Shanghai and there is no Beijing. And you can dig in Shanghai or in Beijing for a very long time and you will never find a bamboo slip. The only way the most prestigious institutions of China obtain what are now the most prestigious archaeological materials is by getting looted materials. This has something to do with the way Chinese archaeology works. That is, when a manuscript is found, for example, in Jingzhou, it will never leave Jingzhou. It will not go to Beijing. It will not go to Shanghai, nor will the scholars from Beijing or Shanghai be invited to work on this manuscript. Yeah, it is strictly local. And so the only way a place like Beida or Tsinghua could get these things is to get stolen things. I think this is a huge ethical problem. It's also a big problem for our scholarship, and we can talk about this more later. But I just want to point this out because all too often people talk about these manuscripts and they never say that. I think we need to say it. Okay. So some of these manuscripts that went to Tsinghua, Anhui, and so on are related once again to the Shijing. And as I said, the Shijing is the one text that is quoted most often in all early literature. Here is a larger image of a bamboo manuscript, and you see one thing here. You see this line there. This is where you see this there. You see it very nicely. This is where these horizontal strings, typically of silk, or in cheaper versions of hemp, run across these bamboo slips. And so the bamboo slips are knotted together very tightly. And then you can roll this thing like a sushi mat. And that's how these manuscripts existed. I show you only this. This is something completely different. And it's not bamboo, but wood. But this is how it works. Yeah, this is how it is connected. Now, where am I? Let's start with the Shanghai Museum manuscript. It has 29 bamboo slips, so it's very short. 29 slips. If you put them together, every slip is about as wide as your finger. It's 30 centimeters. That's all it is. It's a very short manuscript, but it is fragmentary. It's incomplete. We know that. What we do not know, for example, is whether the other parts of that manuscript had simply not survived or had been purchased by other people on the Hong Kong market, private people. We have no idea how many of these manuscripts are in private hands today that we will never see. Yeah. So the fragmentary Shanghai Museum manuscript of 29 slips, and that was titled by the modern editors Kongzi Shilun, Kongzi's discussion of the Shijing, includes brief discussions of selected poems from all sections of the anthology. 3 pieces from the Zhou Song section, the temple hymns, 5 poems from the Daya, but then 21 from the Xiaoya and 23 from the Guofeng, plus 7 titles that are not found in our received Shijing of the Maoshi. 9 of these songs and 1 of the unknown songs are quoted directly. Now, word is that the Shanghai Museum manuscripts were found near Guodian and around the same time as the Guodian tomb. Then next, the Anhui University bamboo manuscript, maybe I go back to this table, which dates to around 300 BCE, as does the Shanghai Museum manuscript, came into the possession of Anhui University in 2015. This manuscript contains 57 poems known from 6 of the 15 Guofeng sections in the received Maoshe. It has 117 numbered bamboo slips. Some of these slips are damaged, some of these slips are missing, but we know there is a number 1 and there is a number 117. And so we know how long this manuscript is. Yeah. The numbers are written at the bottom of the bamboo slips. We will see this in a moment. For 2 decades, from 1993 onward, so when Guodian was found and when Shanghai Museum slips were looted, all our warring states' Shijing evidence came from tomb robberies. That includes Qinghua and Anhui. This means we do not know their archaeological location and context and arrangement. We do not know the owners of the tombs, what other texts and other artifacts were there, and whether our looted manuscripts are complete or incomplete. Then in 2014-15, a tomb was discovered at Xiajiatai in Jingzhou, that's in Hubei, that among many other artifacts and also some other manuscripts included the fragmentary bamboo slips with text from altogether 14 Beifeng poems. So this is one section of the Guofeng. But that's very short, 14 poems. There are 160 poems of Guofeng. 14 poems have been found in fragments at Xiajiatai. Then in 2021, another tomb was discovered in Jingzhou. So same place, right? Also in Jingzhou. So that contained another Shijing manuscript, and this one much larger. On several hundreds of bamboo fragments, many of them, again, only of 1 or 2 characters, but some also much longer, of more than 20 characters, contain parts of about 154 Guofeng poems, plus a number of fragments that cannot be matched to our known Shijing. So if the analysis is correct, then basically that manuscript included the entire Guofeng section. As I said, there are 160 poems. Parts of 154 have been discovered. Both the Xiajiatai and the Wangjiazui manuscripts remain unpublished. So they're still working on these, although, and now I skip forward, on January 9 of this year, so that was, 7 weeks ago, I was able to visit the Jingzhou Museum, inspect some of these fragments, and spend a day with the curator and editor of these slips, a man named Jiang Lujing, a young man who is still writing his dissertation and who is in charge of editing this manuscript. And Jiang Lujing very kindly and openly answered the many questions I have about the slips, and I will tell you a few things that he told me. I show you here some images, 4 or 5, just to give you a sense of what happens after a manuscript has been found. So it's usually found in a pile of mud. It swims in water, in mud, and then it gets to some lab like here, where every slip needs to be cleaned. And they do this very carefully with little brushes, as you see here on the left. Every person manages to about clean 30 slips per day. So this is a long process. And they do this very carefully, very slowly, very patiently, slip after slip. Then comes the man here on the right side who does something else. These slips are, because they survived in this tomb where it was, the tomb was filled with water. Yeah, this is why it survived, because the water went biologically dead. So there are no microbes, there are no organisms, nothing. There's no oxygen. And this is how these things survive in these tombs. But it also means they are very soft. They're like miantiao or spaghetti. They're very soft, right? They break easily and so on. So what this man here does on the right side is he has a long sheet of glass, a narrow sheet of glass, and then he puts the bamboo slip on this long miantiao, and then he takes this string and wraps it around so that this bamboo slip is securely fastened to that glass plate and cannot break again. This is the process. Then in the next step, and there you see Jiang Lujing showing me these things. Then in the next step, they put each of these glass sheets into a long glass tube, which also has liquid in it. And I think this liquid has some chemicals in it. And then they store them. And you see there this box that they have where they store them vertically. Yeah? This is how the Jingzhou Museum stores its bamboo slips. Other places do it differently, but this is one way to do it. Yeah. Now, one of the interesting things is they, when they store them in this box, and they have many such boxes, dozens of boxes, they don't put these slips into these in any particular order. There are all sorts of manuscripts in any of these boxes. There is a little marking. You see that on the top of these. There, written in red, is something on the lids of these little tubes. But when the archaeologists and the lab people are done with their cleaning, they scan the bamboo slip, computerize it, and nobody else will ever work again directly from the bamboo. Everybody works from electronic images, digital images, which is also a problem because a lot of things you cannot see on a digital image, and therefore you have to do something like this. So Jiang Lujing took out his iPhone, and we examined in great detail some of these slips because I wanted to know some very specific things, and he showed them to me, and you can actually see it. It's very exciting, I must say. This was a great day for me. So now, how do we know that all these manuscripts come from tombs? They all are written in what is called Chu script. And if I go back here, this is Chu script, which means I would guess that, is there anybody in this room who can read this? Okay, good. There is nothing mysterious about that script. You just need to be trained to read it. I mean, like you can learn anything, and you can learn how to read Chu script. So how do we know that all of these come from tombs? Well, first of all, they're all in the same script. Second, the bamboo slips have been tested with carbon-14 dating, and they all date from around 300 BCE, plus minus one generation. They all come from the same period, and they're all in the same script. Such true manuscripts from that time could only survive in these waterlogged tombs. But in the damp climate of southern central China, they could not survive above ground, which is very different from, let's say, the northwest of China, where manuscripts from antiquity survive above ground in buildings because it's so super dry. It's the exact opposite. Yeah? But notice also this. We know the locations of Guodian, Xiajiatai, and Wangjiazui. And we think we know that Shanghai Museum is also near Guodian. We also know some other true bamboo manuscripts that have no Shijing material from Jingzhou and from Jingmen, where Guodian is. Now, all of them are from around 300 BCE. So what happened around 300 BCE in Jingzhou? In 278, as our historical sources tell us, the ancient capital of Chu, a capital called Ying, was destroyed by the invading state of Qin, and the Chu court and nobility were forced eastward until finally ending up in Shouchun, the last Chu capital in Anhui. This is up there. So they had to, they fled from here. They made several steps, had temporary capitals along the way. We don't quite know where, but they ended up in Shouchun. This is then in the Han Dynasty, the court of Liu An, king of Huainan. If all of our Shijing manuscripts, and in fact, if all of our Warring States manuscripts that have any historical, philosophical, or literary contents are all dated from around 300 BCE and are all written in true script, then they probably all come from Jingzhou, from that area. And they all date from the immediate generation before the destruction of Ying. And then from that time on, 278, the next thing we know is Ma Wangdui. That's 100 years later. And we have zero manuscript evidence for this 100 years. Yeah. So for the entire century, from 278 BCE to Ma Wangdui, the first Ma Wangdui tomb was closed in 186 BCE. There is no such evidence of such manuscripts, at least nothing that has been published. There are also no such contents. So I keep saying history, philosophy, literature, including poetry, of course. There are no such contacts in manuscripts from northern China during the Warring States. And even though in Western Han times, we do have northern tombs in Shandong, as well as in Hebei, as north as in Hebei in Dingzhou, that contain literary and philosophical manuscripts. So these come from the Han. In Dingzhou, in Hebei, for example, a bamboo text, Lunyu, was found. And finally, after the destruction of Ying in 278, even from Hubei, we know of administrative, legal, and occult writings that come from Shui Hudi, Longjiang and Zhoujiatai in the late 3rd century. You see Shui Hudi up there. The others are all here in this area. And they date from the late 3rd century BCE, and they are administrative and technical writings, but not something like Shijing. Now, could it be that the Tsinghua and Anhui University manuscripts that are looted, could it be that they also come from Jingzhou and they're in the same script? And they're also with the same date. Where else could they possibly come from? We have found, archaeologists have found, well over 10,000 Chu tombs in all over ancient Chu, not just in Jingzhou. But the manuscripts are only in Jingzhou. Yeah. So could it be that the Anhui University and Tsinghua University manuscripts come from far away from Jingzhou? Well, of course, everything is possible. But note also that the writing style of Chu script changed relatively quickly and was very localized. So these scribes at Shui Hudi and other places in the late 3rd century, so halfway between the destruction of Ying and Ma Wangdui, they already did no longer write in Chu script. Yeah. So within a few decades, that script had already been abandoned in this same area. And of course, the same is true then for the Qin and Han scribes in Changsha and in Fuyang. So did scribes far away from Jingzhou in 300 BCE write in the same style as those in Jingzhou? Well, for the complete lack of archaeological evidence of Chu script from anywhere else, I would find that very surprising if it suddenly came up. But who knows, maybe it does come up. Now, what does all of this mean? According to our current evidence, we cannot speak in broadly general terms of warring states, historical, philosophical, or literary manuscripts in ancient tombs. We have no such manuscripts at all from northern China, and in the south, they are all from the same time and from the same place, Jingzhou in 300. It is not plausible that they could only survive there because of very favorable environmental conditions, because such manuscripts did then survive in the Han, from Changsha, from Fuyang, from Dingzhou, and so on. So they could have just as well survived a century earlier. So could it be then, if we continue to ask these questions, Could it be that the habit of putting texts into tombs, that we think, oh, the ancient Chinese, they all did that? Could it be that this was actually just the habit of the cultural elite and political elite of Chu at the time of Ying in Jingzhou, and not before and not after, until 100 years later in the Han, they started it again? It's entirely possible. In short, when talking about historical, philosophical, and literary texts from ancient China, we cannot claim, as constantly happens in scholarship, that we have evidence from all over China across the entire Warring States period. We do not. In reality, all our evidence so far appears to come exclusively from Jingzhou around 300. Now, especially in today's nationalistic scholarly climate of 走出一儒时代. This is the big slogan coined by Li Xueqin, leaving the time of doubting antiquity behind us and trusting antiquity. Now, in this nationalist scholarly climate, where the archaeology of ancient China has become a government priority, and here you see some famous manuscript experts with names such as Wen Jiabao and Shijing inspecting the Tsinghua University manuscripts. It is important at a time when it's clearly so important for the government. It's important to be precise and to be honest about what we know and what we don't. Enthusiastic claims that the Shijing was broadly circulating in writing all over China during the Warring States and even earlier are without evidence. So we have to seek the truth from the facts. Today, I will try to show you what we can say and cannot say about the Shijing in the Warring States based on real evidence from manuscripts. So, were these texts complete? Was the Shijing complete? How is it related to our received Maoshi? Was it already always written? Was there a kind of Dingben, a fixed version, a standard version of the poems and the anthology? Were the poems always understood in the same way? And what is the relationship between their interpretation and their writing? And before I start, just one caveat. I do treat the Shanghai Museum, Anhui University, and Tsinghua University manuscripts as real. I do not treat them as forgeries. Not that we can actually prove that, but I have some confidence that they are not modern forgeries. If we were to exclude these manuscripts, of course, then all our Warring States manuscripts come directly from Jingzhou. Now, having now talked about time and place, let us look at content. We should not be surprised to find that the complete Shijing in the tomb of Hai Hunhou, so Liu He in the 1st century, that there is a complete Shijing there, because after all, this tomb comes not only from the middle of the Western Han, so much later, and it also belongs to the highest elite of government. Liu He was the emperor, at least for 27 days. If anyone, then he had full access to that, because at that time, the Shijing was long institutionalized at the Imperial Academy. But what about earlier? As I mentioned, the Wuxing and Ziyi manuscripts from Guodian, Ma Wangdui, and in the possession of the Shanghai Museum quote a small number of Shijing poems. Where am I? Here. Quote a small number of Shijing poems. In the Ziyi, just as in most received philosophical texts from early China, think Xunzi, Mengzi, Li Ji, and so on, the quotations are mostly from the Daya, which routinely are invoked to cap an argument with a quotation from an authoritative text. So if you want to make a philosophical or political argument, and then you say, and this is why it says in the Daya, so and so. And then comes a short quotation. And then it comes, this is what it says. This is what it means. The Tsinghua University manuscripts contain one Guofeng and one Zhousong poem. The Shanghai Museum Kongzi Shilun, as I mentioned earlier, has a little bit of Zhousong and Daya, but mostly Xiaoya and Guofeng. These are the texts where the Shijing poems appear within the text, be that a philosophical argument, a historical anecdote, or discussion. But what about the manuscripts that simply contain the poems by themselves and nothing else? No commentary, no context. Here it gets interesting. Huyang in the Han, 65 guofeng, 4 xiaoya. Xiajiatai, 14 guofeng. Anhui University, 57 guofeng. Wangjiazui, 154 guofeng. And nothing else. The pattern from all our finds thus far is, while in philosophical texts you find the Daya quoted, there is no trace of the Daya or Zhousong in these anthologies that come from tombs. They have a completely different history of transmission. They are not in these tombs. You know? So this, of course, makes us think, what is the Shijing at that time? How do we explain that all these tombs have only guofeng? There's no question that the Daya were known in the Warring States, or at least the same signature sentences from them that are always quoted were known and appear in Shijing quotations in early texts, as Professor He Zhihua has shown us. It's also clear that based on our evidence so far, people wrote down the guofeng far more often than they wrote down the Daya and the Zhousong. Why? We don't know. But there is one thing we can say. None of these manuscripts were intended as the complete Shijing, or as it was called in Luanyu or Mozi, the Shi Sanbai, the 300 poems. None of these manuscripts is part of a lineage of copying this whole anthology. They all stand outside of it. So what are they and what are they for? I can only think of one purpose. They were created in local contexts of teaching. This purpose, I think, is already entirely clear from the Kongzi Shilun manuscript, which I wrote about some years ago, where in its discussions of the individual poems, the manuscript explains something, how you use every Shijing song. Not what does it mean, what is it good for, right? But these comments are so terse and so cryptic that anyone who does not already know the poems has no idea what this is about. You have to know the poems already in order to be able to read the manuscript. So there has to be a social context, there has to be a community, and probably a community of teachers and students. The same is true in particular of the manuscripts that appear like these partial anthologies of the Shijing. They lack context, they only have poems. But who can read these poems? The first thing we notice is that the Shijing texts appear to be luxury items, in the sense that they're very generously spaced and written on bamboo slips that are very long. As such, they must have been quite difficult and impractical to handle. This is also true for the Tsinghua and Shanghai Museum manuscripts. The Tsinghua slips measure between 45 and 48 centimeters in length. That's this long. And this is bamboo, very thin slips. You can imagine how easily this breaks, right? So almost 50 centimeters long. Shanghai Museum, up to 55 centimeters. Anhui University, 48 centimeters. Jingzhou, 46 centimeters. By contrast, administrative slips that had some practical use in daily life are typically only half as long, much easier to handle, and much easier not to break. They also, administrative texts, and this is why I show you these two manuscripts here. You see again the Guodian Laozi, and then you see some manuscript, some administrative writing. You see the difference. The thing on the left is a luxury item. It has a display function. It has beauty, and it's very generous with its space. It doesn't try to save space. There's no shortage of bamboo. Yeah? When you look at the administrative text on the right, you see the opposite. Not very beautiful writing, no spacing, but cramming as much content into as little space as you can possibly do. That's a practical text. The one on the left is not a practical text. So this is the difference. Now, as we all know, the Shijing language is not the language used in Warring States narrative or philosophical texts. It is by far a more archaic idiom. The Daya contain lengthy historical narratives and are mostly clear in their meaning, except for a few lines. Philosophical texts contain arguments, and you can follow the argument. Historical texts tell stories, and you can follow the stories. Yet the Guofeng that we find in Anda and Jingzhou anthologies do not contain a single historical narrative, nor do they develop philosophical arguments, nor do they have stories. They are instead highly associative in their language and extremely difficult to interpret. The poetic idiom is full of rhyming and reduplicative binomes almost never used in any other genre. And most importantly, their rare words are always written differently. 20-some years ago, I counted the Shijing variants in all the Shijing quotations in excavated manuscripts at that time. So at that time, we didn't have Anhui or Qinghua. And then I compared them to the Maoshe, the received text, and then to the fragments of the so-called Sanjia, the three schools of Shijing scholarship in the Han. And I compared the same passages that are in the manuscripts to the same passages in Maoshe and in the Sanjia. And I found, as you can see in this table, this is the percentage of difference of characters between the Maoshe and the Sanjia. And this is the percentage of variance between the manuscripts and the Maoshe, between the manuscripts and the Sanjia, and among the manuscripts. So even when two manuscript texts come from the same period and from the same place, their writing, their choice of characters differs by something like 40%. Now, then you have to subtract the characters, the common characters that are always written in the same way, like particles, like Shuzi, like yi, or something like this, or simple words like wang or bai, such words. If you take these words out, then, of course, that ratio shoots up to much, much higher levels, especially when you remove the Shuzi. So, let me jump here. So the same is then true for all the Warring States Shijing materials that have been found since 20 years ago. Whenever we see texts that have the same Guofeng poem written down, it is written in often dramatically different characters. Almost all of them are what we call graphic variants. That is, the character is different, but the sound is the same, because you have so many words in early Chinese that have exactly the same sound. And you can, when you write that word that is normally written with one character, you can write that word with a character that is normally used for another word of the same sound. This is what is called Tongjia or Jiajie. Yeah? This is extremely common. So in other words, even if you can read true script, you still don't know what you are reading because you don't know what the words are. You only know what the characters are. You don't know which word is behind the character. So how do we read it? How do you know what is written there? Well, we cannot read it unless we already know it. Again, this puts us in the situation that these manuscripts are not for reading. They are useless. If you give this to any person in the 3rd century BCE and say, here, read it, go home, read it, that person has no way to read it, just as we have no way. Yeah. Okay. So now, this was the big picture, and now I'm coming finally to some more specific things. Please bear with me. I might have to go a little bit over time. The pictures are always such a distraction. They take more time. What you are looking at here is Anhui University, and what you're looking at is the Shijing and the Shijing manuscript. This is how it looks like. And I told you that these bamboo slips are numbered at the bottom. So there's the little number, for example, or there, or there. So you have to imagine that this unit is one long bamboo slip. They just cut it up to fit it on the page, right? So it starts up there, and then you read it like 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Let us start with just one poem. This is the poem Shijing, which is in the received Maoshe. It's in the Tangfeng section. And it is in the Tsinghua manuscript, in the Tsinghua University manuscript. Everything that you see here that is black is the same between Maoshe and manuscript. Everything that's red is different. Now, how much is different and how much is the same, right? So I take you through the differences right now, one after another. First, there are many, many textual variants that are simply different graphs, presumably writing the same word with a different graph. So I highlight here the yellow. That's what I'm talking about. Then there are also a smaller number of lexical variants, which means not only different graphs, but clearly also different sounds, because we reconstruct the sounds, and therefore different words with different meanings. All of this exists there. The perspective of speech is different between Tsinghua and Maoshe. Here it is Junzi, there it is Wo. The Tsinghua manuscript contains 2 additional lines per stanza, and these are also longer. But interestingly, the language that you find in these lines is not absent in the Maoshe. It's not simply added at the end, but it's actually language that you find earlier in the Maoshe lines. So for example, when you look at this here in Maoshe, right? You find that also here. So, transpositions. The rhymes are completely different between Maoshe and manuscript. And finally, stanzas 1 and 3 seem to be reversed. What is stanza 1 in the one text is stanza 3 in the other. So this summarizes what I just said. Now let's go to the Anhui University manuscript and look at one case, simply 2 words actually in Guanju. After I just showed you really the outer limits of textual variation between a manuscript and the poem that we know. And if you think, that's the extreme, how much difference there can be. And you have to ask, of course, is this one poem in 2 versions, or are these actually 2 different poems that, however, share 90% of their language? Yeah. And it's impossible to make that decision. What we have to think is that both are derived from a certain idea and repertoire of ideas and repertoire of expressions that could be recomposed in new ways again and again. And that's what we see. Yeah. Okay. Now, let's go to something specific. Oh, by the way, I forgot. In the manuscript, this poem, Shijing, is embedded in a story. Duke of Zhou, military victory, gets up at the banquet, recites the poem. So Duke of Zhou, that's, 11th century, right? In the Maoshe, there's a preface to the poem that dates it to the 9th century. Now what? 11th century or 9th century? So you see how fluid this entire situation is. Now, let's look at the Anhui University manuscript. What do we see? We see some poems, and remember, there are 57 poems in the Anda manuscript. Some poems are in a different section, also in a different sequence. Many poems have their stanza sequence reversed. First stanza is third stanza, and so on. Some poems are longer or shorter. Some lines are contracted or expanded, or they're transposed. Countless variants, even within a single poem, even within a single stanza. One can use different graphs to write the same words, and one can use the same graphs to write different words. This is what we see in manuscripts. As a result, no reader knows what they're reading. And then, as I mentioned, there's only Guofa. Now, let us briefly mention this Wang Jiazui manuscript again that I visited in January. And there you see the name of Jiang Lujing, who's the main person there. And here's what I learned from him. The characters have very large spacing. Yet published. Otherwise, I would show you the slips, but I cannot. Right? A small number of text fragments cannot be matched to the Maoshe. Because the text is so fragmentary, we don't know how much is missing or different. In some sections, the order of the poems is clearly different. In some poems, the order of the stanza is different. In some poems, the order of lines is different. Most variants are graphic, that is, they write the same sound. In other words, the differences we see in Wang Jiazui are exactly the same differences that we see in Anhui University and that we see in Tsinghua, which confirms in a way that these looted manuscripts, they fall into the same limits as now Wang Jiazui, because that has been excavated, and which gives us some trust in the looted ones as well. Okay, so Guanju, now comes the real business, and now it gets a little technical. So if you find that, if there's something that you don't understand, please ask me afterwards. I'm happy to explain it. You probably all learned Guanju in middle school. You probably can all recite it or sing it. So I don't have to sing it now. And you all know the lines. 关关雎鸠，在河之洲。窈窕淑女，君子好逑。Beautiful. I only want to talk about two words in this poem today. One, 窈窕. Two, this. 求之不得，寤寐思妇。And then 犹在犹在. Okay, I want to talk about this, and that you will very soon see why. Here on the right hand, you see now greatly enlarged the bamboo slip from Anhui University. And this is Yao, and this is Di. It's this character. And this is this, and this is Nu. Now, this writing is very common for this Shu. This is totally normal in Shu script. Here you have basically the Yao, and then this is this. This is Yao Jiao Shu Nu. This is this Yao Jiao. Yeah. The Anhui University editors think that they interpret. This is purely interpretation, pure guesswork on their end. They take the Yao and they say, oh, let's read it as this. And then they take the Di and then they say, oh, let's add a Nuzipang. And then we get to the right pronunciation so that we get back to Yao Jiao. Yeah. And then they also make an argument and say, and you can read this all here, they say, okay, so this actually, as you see here, what they choose here and here, this actually is to some extent about the beauty of the woman. Yeah, so she's very miaotiao. Yeah, and this is clearly also about her beauty. Now, if you look at this, which is our Yaoqiao that we know, you would never, ever come up with the idea to write this like this. And when you read this, you never, ever would think that you're actually reading this unless you already know it. This is what I mean. This is the degree of difference that people are struggling with, right? Now let's go on. This is this line, 物昧师傅 in the Mao Shi. But what do we actually have here? So we have some form of wu. You see, this is the part, this wu. This is the part that carries the sound. Yeah, and the reason why this can be understood as this is that this sound part is also here. It's the same sound part. So this suggests that they're very, very similar in pronunciation. Okay, so you can use this graph to write that graph. And here you have the same. This is the sound graph here. And here you have simply this roof above it in the received text. The si is the same, that's this. But then Anda has this, Hofu. And the Anda editors say, this is this. Why do they say this? They only say this because they have no idea what that is. Nobody has ever seen this graph. This graph does not exist in any other manuscript. And they say it's this because this is what we have in the Mao Shi. And so the strategy of the editors of these bamboo manuscripts is, if you can't read it, just turn it into Mao Shi, and it works. That's the strategy. And then when you're done, you say, 怪不得，就是一个Mao Shi. It's just the same text, right? But as a matter of fact, it is only through their procedures of editing that you end up with the same text. Now, what is the alternative? So let's look at Yaoqiao. And this, I take you through a few things there. This is very interesting. So this is the Mao commentary on Yaoqiao. Youxian means something like chaste and shy and secluded. So she's very virtuous. She's very, very virtuous. And then on this Si Fu, right? Wu Mei Si Fu. They say Fu, Si Zhi Ye. So Wu Mei Si Fu. How can the Fu mean Si Zhi Ye? And then Zheng Xuan in the Eastern Han says Fu Shi Ye. 就贤女而不得。绝昧思以实事。I do not understand that. And I don't think Zheng Xuan understood it or anybody else. This is a case where you have a very strange line in the Mao Shi that actually nobody understands. Why is there this fu? What does that fu do there? What is the meaning of this fu? We have really no traditional commentator has been able to explain that. Okay, so this is our problem. Now, let's go back to Yaoqiao. You have seen how Yaoqiao is written in Anda, totally different. Now, Yaoqiao also appears in another Shijing poem, in the Chenfeng, namely, it is written like this, which, and you know how the Mao commentary comments on Guanju, that Guanju is about the virtue of the queen. 后妃之德也. Here's the Mao commentary on this Chenfeng poem, 月初. 自好色也，在位不好德，而越美色也. That's the opposite. That's the exact opposite. Yeah. Now, you see then that in the Qing, Ma Ruichen, the great scholar of the Shijing, has immediately identified, okay, this is actually the same as Yaoqiao, and there he says it, right? And he also says what it is about. And he says it has nothing to do with what the Mao Zhuan tells you. So this was what the Qing commentator, the Kao Zheng Xuejia, tells us. And if you want another piece of evidence, Su Shi Qian Chi Bi Fu, right? Very early in the Qian Chi Bi Fu, there is Song Ming Yue Zhi Shi Ge Yao Tiao Zhi Zhang. Yeah, this is, of course, this poem. There is no Ming Yue in Guanju. When Su Shi read this poem or knew this poem, he knew this with this Yao Tiao that is in Guanju. So this is clear. This is very good evidence. Now, evidence for manuscripts. So the first one here, this is Mao Shi received text. This is Anda. This is Ma Wangdui Wu Xing. This is how it's written there. And you see all these different writings, and this is now, and now it gets interesting, this is what we do with historical phonetics. We reconstruct the sounds. And what you see here with all these four words, they are extremely similar in sound. They're written totally different, and they have the same sounds, which means they are all writing the same word, simply with different characters. This is how Chinese was used, the Chinese script was used as a phonetic script. Yeah. Okay. Then you have, by the way, in Chu Zi, you also have a Yao Tiao, which is also about not chastity and virtue, but beauty and desire. So, what is Guanju? Here are a couple of passages, the first three from transmitted text, the second two from manuscripts. Liu An, in his commentary, in his comment on the Li Sao, says, 果风好色而不淫. And then, of course, we know 论语, 关雎, 乐而不淫. You hear the echoes there, right? Then 荀子大略, 果风之好色也. 传曰, 淫其欲, 不遣其志. What do they all say? They all say the 果风 and especially Guanju as a representative is about sexual desire. But it is about sexual desire in order to teach you how to control it, how to become a moral person after you have that experience of desire. And now look at Ma Wangdui Wu Xing. There's this critical sentence here, and this is the commentary on Guanju. 有色于理尽耳. And then 上博孔子释论, 关雎以色于理. Right? This is exactly what Xunzi, Liu An are talking about. You go from 色 and 好色 to 理. Okay. Then it gets even more interesting. If you look at the Ma Wangdui Wu Xing commentary, I hope we don't have underage children here. This is what Ma Wangdui said. 如此其深也. If his desire is so deep, will he have sexual intercourse in front of his parents? Oh no, of course not. He would rather die to do that. Will he have in front of his brothers? No. In front of the neighbors? No. Now, where have we seen this? Look at one of the most notorious poems in the Shijing, 将中子 in the 正风. 为我父母, 为我主兄, 为人之多言. That's exactly that sequence. Ma Wangdui discusses Guanju through the paradigm of a poem that in the traditional reading is one of the most inappropriate poems in the whole Shijing. So they're not on opposite ends for the Ma Wangdui people. They belong together. Yeah. So we look again at what we have here with Anda Jian. And now we go to this Hu. So I have already shown you what is going on with Yao Tiao. Yao Tiao does not mean chaste and virtuous. It means in evidence after evidence, the opposite. Okay, now let's look at Fu. So we can actually reconstruct this phonetically, and we get to something like byok. Now, fu almost never appears in any true manuscript. Whenever it appears, in almost all cases, it is written as bei. And fu and bei can be interchanged. They have the same sound. You would not know this from modern Mandarin, but this is what it is. Okay, so this is the normal case. Now, there are three cases in Anda where Anda writes, where Maoshe has this and Anda writes this. Only in Guanju, where Maoshe has this, Guanda has this, Anda has this. Why? Why not bei? Why is this one case different from all the others? The Anda editors never ask that question and never answer it, right? But look at all the options that we have here. All of this is possible chronologically. You can read, if you can read this fu as bei, you can also read this fu as any of these bei or pei, right? But this is not all there is. And of course, what would this mean? To pair, to come together. The theme of course, this poem. Here we have Mawangdui Wuxing, and look what Mawangdui Wuxing has for this fu. It has this fu, byok. It's almost exactly identical sound. And what does this fu mean? To submit yourself. Yeah. So, Wu Mei Si Fu. I cannot sleep. Awake and asleep, I think of how she will submit herself. I long for her submitting herself to me. This is what it means. It has nothing to do with fu to fu. And when the Anda editors give you fu to fu simply because it's in Maoshe, that's just Husho Badao. That doesn't make any sense. And here I give you the evidence that from the publication. If bei, the fu, bei, fu, right? And here, bei, and then it's suddenly this. Yeah. So, and then we have other evidence where we see how phrases that we know from Guanju also appears in poems that are considered inappropriate. For example, in this poem here, Zipi, yeah, is also, of course, criticizing a ruler who is indulging in his desires. And look at these lines, and you see that is a paraphrase of exactly what you have in Guanju. So, long story short, we have this. Anda reading of Guanju matches exactly what we find in Kongzi Shilun and Mawangdui Wuxing. The Anda writing does not match the Maoshe interpretation. It has nothing to do with fu to fu. It makes no sense to read Yao Tiao as a reference to physical beauty of the woman, which is what the Anda editors first do, and then read fu in the moralizing sense of the Maoshe. Why not stay with that reading, right? And now it gets the most important points. It is not the case that there was an objective Shi written text and then there were different interpretations. Instead, the different interpretations influenced the writing of the text itself. The text is written in a certain way because the person who writes it understands the text in a certain way. When there are so many options because of the words that have the same sound. So every written form is secondary to the sound of the poem and how the audience understands the words. We cannot say which version is more correct or more original or more early. We can only say that from some particular characters, we see different understandings of the poem. The fact that the characters are close in sound does not mean that the scribes understood the poem in the same way. You can understand the same sounds and you understand different words. So to say that the Anda manuscript or the Jingzhou manuscript can be read closely against the Maozhi and can be reconstructed as an early version of the Maozhi is entirely meaningless unless we examine the interpretations of the individual characters. Yeah. So the procedure of the editors that give us these edited versions are not helping us. Okay, and then there are a couple more conclusions that you can read yourself, but this is my main point. If you're looking for a single standardized Shijing in the Warring States, I'm sorry, I cannot show it to you. Thank you. Now what? Oh.
Thank you, Professor Kern, for this inspiring lecture. So now we will move on to the Q&A section. May we now invite Professor Chang and Professor Kern for the Q&A section.
Okay, thank you so much, Martin. So please have a seat and enjoy the hot drink. Okay, before we move on to the Q&A sections, I want to express my sincere thankfulness to Professor Martin Kern. His invaluable expertise and meticulous research have enriched my understanding of Shijing in the Warring States period. I think the newly discovered manuscript, which I've just mentioned in Martin's lecture, not only reveal how the Shijing transmit and use, but also showcased the dynamic, the different interpretation of this text. And all we can see is the dynamic relationship between the interpretation and the written text itself. So I am, and we are really grateful to Professor Martin Kern for this enlightening lectures. So let's give our big hands to Professor Martin Kern once again. Okay, thank you. So now we move on to the questions. Guests are welcome to raise your questions either in English or Mandarin. Okay, 我们刚才听到 Martin 的国语非常好啊，你可以用国语回答，
请不要用广东话。
Okay. So our first questions.
Thank you so much, Martin. As Professor John just said, thank you so much for such a wonderful lectures once again. I totally agree with you. There are many different versions during the Warring States period, as you have just mentioned. And I think I suppose you agree that in the coming future, more and more versions of the Shijing will be excavated in mainland China. So the difference between not just the variant readings, as you have mentioned, in fact, it's the interpretations. So my question is, can you estimate how many schools, just like in the Han Dynasty, there are 3 schools except the Maozhi. How many schools in the earlier Han Dynasties or in the Warring States of this song, a book of the songs, and how different they are? Thank you.
Yeah, the only reason why we speak of schools, Jia, to begin with, is of course that these Sanjia were officially recognized at the imperial court, where they were given professors, Boshi, to study them and to teach them, right? These were officially sanctioned schools at the imperial court, in the imperial academy. Now, Ma Wangdui is also Han. That clearly stands outside of those readings. of the Sanjia and of the Maoshi. And the biggest difference between what we find in all the manuscripts, whether it's Zhangbo or Mao Wangdui or Guodian or Anda, the biggest difference between what these texts show us and what the Han Dynasty 4 schools, so Maoshi, Lushi, Qishi, Hanshi, show us, is that the manuscripts never talk about history. They talk about the Shi as vehicles for moral cultivation. They don't talk about King Wen or some ruler from the 9th century in some state who needed to be criticized. They have no interest in history. It is only the Han text that need to use a text like Shijing to reconstruct history, and then turn that around and then reconstruct the meaning of the poems for that history. So for the Han so-called schools, the Shijing is in the service of history. When it says, oh, this poem criticizes this ruler and this poem criticizes that ruler and so on, right? The pre-imperial texts don't do that, nor does Mao Wangdui. And how many different versions and understandings are there then? Well, we don't really know, but what we do seem to see is that the evidence that we have for Guanju, it actually all is it's one interpretation. It's not many different interpretations. It's just that this one is very different from the Han interpretations of the 4 schools. Yeah. Now, how should we think about this? I'm sure that different communities understood things differently, and they wrote them differently. This is why it's written differently every time. Now, the question is, how many of these communities are there? Well, every time I think you have at a court or in a teaching situation, you have a teacher instructing students in the Shijing, because it's the most important text and it teaches you everything about what you need to know in life. There can be always some difference because it's all local. It's not that you can line them up along one line historically and say this is earlier and then comes this and then this and this. No, they exist at the same time in different places, sometimes very close to each other, still different, because they all do their own thing. And then they write down the poems according to their own understanding. And as a result, they're always written differently, which means the written form is not what defines the poetry. The poetry needs to be memorized, it needs to be recited. And my suspicion actually is that a lot of these manuscripts that we see are actually school texts. They might even be written by students. For example, in the Anhui University manuscript, you have punctuation. I don't know if you noticed that some of these manuscripts, the Bambuse, they have these little black dots sometimes here or there. This is a form of punctuation that regularly, after every 4 characters, very regularly. And then it gets less and less, and it makes lots of mistakes. It puts punctuation marks in the middle of a line, and then it stops altogether. What's going on here? Who did this? So it is very well possible that these are school texts and that they are written by students in such settings where the teacher says, write it down. And then you write it down. Or the teacher gives it to you and says, okay, punctuate it. Just what we do, right? When we teach classical Chinese, unpunctuated texts, go punctuate, right? And then you make mistakes. This is what it looks like to me. So there is no limit to the differences. But there are also, I believe, no schools in the sense of what you have at the Western Han Court institutionalized at the Imperial Academy.
Thank you, Professor Ho. Okay, Professor Tang from Hong Kong U.
Thank you, Professor Kern, for your wonderful and fascinating talk. And the question I want to know is just a very quick question. And I noticed that you have shown a list that the excavated materials that are related to Shijing. And in the Qinghua manuscript, you have only mentioned Qiyue and also Zhou Gong Zhi Qin Wu. But all we know, we have another script that is called
Yes.
Yuri Liang Fu Bi. And no, because some researchers nowadays we consider it may not belong to the Shi, or some even think that they belong to the Shu. I would like to know what's your views on the category of this kind of Yuri Liang Fu Bi, but because it's much longer than the usual Shi. And I just want to know your opinion.
This is a very good question. It's also a very specialized question that maybe not everybody.
Professor Tang works a lot on this. Professor Tang works a lot on this topic.
Yes, but maybe most of the rest of us may not be familiar with the exact background. So there is this text which looks like poetry, but of course is not in the Shijing, and is also somehow different and longer and so on. It seems there is no, well, two things. Number one, when we look at manuscripts that say they talk about the Shijing, for example, the so-called Kongzi Shilun, or when we look at these anthologies like Wang Jiazui, Anda, the number of things that we did not know from the Maoshi is extremely small. If we reconstruct that these are the same sequences of sounds, and therefore these are the poems, however they are interpreted and written. It's not the case that the Kongzi Shilun talks about a lot of other poems that we have no idea what they are. It's not the case that Anda Jian or these Jingzhou Jian have a lot of other poems. There is a little bit, but there's very little. It's the same as in Zhuozhuan, where you have some poems that we cannot find in the Maoshi. So what that suggests is, number one, by the 4th century, so our time here in Jingzhou, 300 BCE, by the time of the 4th century, there is clearly a canon of poetry that is defined as this is the Shi. Otherwise, we would see more things in manuscripts that are not in our received text. But we see so little. So there is a defined canon. That being said, there is still something on the margins of that canon where individual lines, maybe individual stanzas, appear that we cannot match to the Maoshi. Now, when we, on the other hand, get a longer text that is entirely alien to then I would say it was probably not considered to be part of that canon. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not poetry. In fact, it is a very strange thing. Why do we not find more poetry? Why is there so little poetry in early China outside of Shijing and then Zhuzi? But Zhuzi is a totally different thing. We leave that aside for a moment. As if once you have a Shi, that is the end of poetry, right? And then we also have passages in received text where sentences in Zhuozhuan, for example, are quoted as Shi, when in reality they are in the Shu, in the Shangshu, and vice versa. And of course, we have in the Shangshu, but also in a lot of the Zhuzi, long passages that are rhymed. that have the characteristics of poetry, but they are never considered to be part of the Shi canon. Half of Xunzi is rhymed, Zhuangzi is rhymed, Laozi is rhymed. I mean, Huainanzi is rhymed. It's everywhere. Half of the Shangshu is rhymed. People don't pay attention to that. There is no definition of what is poetry and what is not poetry in early China. If you ask me what is, there's not even a word for poetry as far as I'm concerned, because the word shi really means the canon and not all the other things. So from that, putting all of that together, I would say that the text that you're talking about, poetic as it may be, is just one of many, many other poetic texts, but it's not part of the canon. I don't know, does that make sense to you? I don't know how you see it.
Any response to the time? Okay. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kern. Yeah, I would like to know your opinion about I'm Andre Fetch from the Baptist University. Yeah, I would like to know your opinion, your view on the role of the dialects in the transmission of the Shijing.
Yes, I would like to know that too. Chinese scholars and also Western scholars of the last centuries, so this is throughout the Qing dynasty, but also in the 20th century, have tried to figure out, are there dialect differences in the poems? Because it says, right, there are 15 Guo, and they're all in the north. The most southernmost one is Chen. They're all in the north along the Yellow River basically from the east and then going west. And so they're not in the same place. They're also coming from different periods. And yet nobody has succeeded in identifying dialect differences. Nobody. How do we explain that, right? When we have poems that seem earlier, hundreds of years earlier, and others later. I mean, when we look at Shakespeare, it's not the same language as our language, right? So how do we explain that? And I think the only explanation that we have is that at one point, when the poems became canonical, they were edited into a language that was not a local language. That was what Kongzi in the Lunyu calls Yayan. Yeah, he says, Yayan, I only use for three things: the Shi, the Shu, and Zhili, matters of ritual. Yeah. I tend to compare this to, in the European tradition, to church Latin. You can, if you're a member of the Catholic Church, you can be anywhere in the world in the medieval period, and you can communicate in church Latin. In fact, even today, the bishops communicate in Latin, and not in their vernaculars, in their local languages or dialects. And I think this is what happened to the Shi and also to the Shu. They are probably an archaizing idiom that nobody spoke anymore in the 4th century, but that was reserved for this kind of text. And that made these texts universally communicable. So when in Zhuan, people from all the different states come together and recite poetry to each other, apparently they all understand each other. How come? How is that possible, right? Well, because it's not any of their own languages. I think that is the only answer we have. Nobody has ever had a better answer. Sorry that I can't really give you anything more than that.
the different writings, transcriptions of the Shijing as reflection
No.
of the.
Totally not, because they fall exactly into the same sound patterns. I mean, you just saw it. Now, how solid is all of this? You know, historical phonology is not easy. There are some parts of these reconstructions that are very solid, the vowels, the rhymes. There are some parts that are not very solid, especially the initials and the initial clusters. The phonologists know that this is not all certain, but they have succeeded to create a system that actually is based on the Shijing. But remarkably, we can read the manuscripts within the boundaries of that system. So even if the actual sounds may have been different, the relationships between the different sounds are probably fairly accurate. And the manuscripts don't give us a different sound system at all, even though this is true, yeah, and not the North.
Okay, I just want to remind the online audience that you can raise your questions and I will read for you because we don't have questions from online.
就是我想问一个问题，就是您的那个上古音的拟音，好像以我所知，现在比较流行的是 Baxter and Cigar 和
Yes.
那个郑张尚方先生的。
Yes.
我感觉您用的好像这两家都不是。
不是，我用了 Schüssler。
哦
Schüssler 离 Baxter 和 Cigar 非常近。为什么用 Schüssler？ 因为这样写是简单一点。你看 Baxter Cigar 非常非常不容易懂。因为他们的这些符号是特别复杂。就是一个声音，有的符号是另外一个东西，所以我一般的来说用 Schüssler， 因为这样我们能表达出来这个同音或者不同音更简单一点。But Schüssler is just as good as Baxter and Cigar. I mean, it's not that they are the masters of the universe. And in fact, I don't really like what Baxter and Cigar do. And I tell you why. Baxter and Cigar are linguists who are interested in the linguistic study of the language, but they have no other interest. I once talked with Baxter, whom I know quite well. I said, you know, you have a mistake in one of your reconstructions in one of the poems. You think this is a Heyun, two words that are not really rhyming, but Baxter says they rhyme. And I said, I can tell you from a literary analysis of the poem why these not rhyme. They cannot rhyme. And he says, I will not allow literary analysis to contaminate the system. Well, that is actually not a bad thing, because that means he's very rigorous in his statistical methods. And that is good, because this way you can falsify it. Because he's very transparent. He doesn't allow all sorts of stuff from left and right to enter his system, and then it all becomes 乱七八糟, yeah? And nobody can find out what is it actually, what they're based on. So I respect that. But that's not the end of the story. And what I find we need to do is we need to take one of these existing transcription systems that we have and that are all very sophisticated and see how we can use it when we do our literary analysis, because that's what I do. I'm not a linguist. Okay, I hope that satisfies you.
Actually, we have an expert in Asian Chinese phonology.
Oh,
Professor Guobiji from my department.
Oh.
Professor Guo, do you have any response or comments on this?
in some sense, Switzerland reconstruction is better than Baxter and Sackers.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question.
There are two questions there in the middle. One is Janice, and then her neighbor.
Lawrence.
Take the mic. I cannot hear you.
Thank you for your stimulative talk. I would like to ask more about the phenomenon of different stanza orders, because apart from the first manuscript serving as the most original proto-texts, the discussion is like a chicken and egg dilemma, that whether a new interpretations lead to the creation of new text, or the new text lead to the new interpretations. May I ask that, is it possible to break out of this circle and exploring the repetitive style, the 重章叠句 poems that like Crackers or the Yellow Bird of Qingfeng section that feature the multiple stanza orders? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I'm almost having the sense that you're asking me two questions. Yeah, that's a good thing. One question is about interpretation. Another question is about stanza sequence. But stanza sequence is not necessarily related to interpretation. When you look at, and people have done this, so there are articles that list all the cases where stanzas are in a different order in these manuscripts. When you look at these studies, you realize that certain stanzas are switched around more often than others, or some stanzas are switched around less often than others. The most stable stanza is typically the first stanza. Is the stanza by which everybody knows the poem. And that tends to stay in the first place, although not always, as you could see with Shijing. In the Qinghua manuscript, in the Anda manuscript, where you also have a Shijing, the stanza is, I remember, the same as in Moshe. But the main thing with the stanza sequence is in the Guofeng, because the Guofeng are not narrative. They don't tell you a story. It is not, in general, that one stanza leads to the next. Instead, what you have is, let's say you have 3 or 4 stanzas, and they all say exactly the same thing, slightly with a slight variation of a few words, only maybe 3 or 4 words. Yeah, when you flip them around, it doesn't change a thing about the interpretation, because the text is not sequential to begin with. You could even go so far and you could say a poem that has 3 such stanzas, you can say these are 3 poems all saying the same thing. Yeah. So as if the poem itself, when it has 3 stanzas, is a kind of anthology of different ways of saying that. And so that has nothing to do with interpretation. That's why I think these are separate. Janice.
Hello. It's a cliche question, but what I want to ask is, how should we strike a balance between 趋同 and 利益? Take a case of Sifu as an example. The traditional explanation of the Maozhuan does not convince me as well. But if we abandon such explanation, then we're left with infinitely many phonetically possible interpretations. Yes. Like for Sifu, we can read it as Sifu longing for her, submitting herself to me, or maybe we can read it as Sipei, as your slides have shown, thinking about how I could deserve her. This way, we could never really reach a conclusion. So my question is, how should we determine when is the time to 趋同 And when is the time to Li Yi? As far as I can see, I'll say Chinese scholars are more inclined to Tong, and Western scholars are more inclined to Li Yi. And so how would you comment on such phenomenon? Thank you.
Well, the first thing is you are probably right in this generalization about Chinese versus Western scholars, but I would say not all Western scholars are doing it the same way. I have a good friend who does it very differently, and we disagree completely. I don't name names, but a very prominent scholar and a very good scholar. So there is no real, here are those guys and there's us and there's them or something like this. And I also see a great range of readings in Chinese scholarship, especially when you look at the scholarship of the younger generation of Chinese scholars. They have a lot of new ideas, which I really cherish and admire. Now, how should we go about it? Look, I think we have to give up the idea that we want the text to be something in particular. I would be more comfortable saying that so far, we really don't have that much evidence. I mean, look, how many manuscripts are these, right? And they're all from the same place and time. So is that really enough to come up with a new standard reading? No, nowhere. We have enough evidence. And this is why in your dichotomy, the Xifangren have the better case. We have enough evidence to reject the old orthodox readings. But we do not have nearly enough to create a new orthodox reading and say, okay, so let's all agree on this. We just can't do it. And what we can do is instead, is what I just showed you. It can be this Fu and Ma Wangdui, and it can be this Bei and Pei and whatever, right? And they all work. Do we know which one it is? No, we do not know. If we are honest, we just say, these are the possibilities that I can think of, and there are probably more that I haven't thought of, but they're all possible. And if I went further and say, and I think it has to be this, then that is actually just an opinion. And I do think there's nothing wrong with opinions, but we have to mark them as this is an opinion and this is a fact. And this is a belief. And these three things are very different. Yeah. So I don't see the need and I don't see the possibility right now to kind of be in a more secure conclusion. And I think for now, and probably for the next 20 years at least, remember, we just started. Ma Wangdui is 50 years ago. This is just all it is, right? I think we have to learn how to be comfortable with this overall uncertainty. We have to just embrace it and accept it, and instead of trying to come up with a new thing. And I once was foolish enough to agree to do a Shijing translation. That's when I was much younger. And then 10 years later, I realized I will never do this because I have some of my colleagues do it. There will be 2 new Shijing translations in English very soon to be published. I do not know how to do that because I don't know what I'm reading. And if I don't know what I'm reading, what shall I do? What kind of translation is that? Then you can only do one thing. You can say, okay, I will translate, and I will translate according to this particular commentary or this particular reading. Okay, and then everything you do follows only that reading, and you don't allow anything else in. Yeah. But we cannot do that on the basis of manuscripts because we don't have a full manuscript. Maybe we will be able to do it with Haihon Ho when this is uncomfortable.
So I think it comes to the last questions. Okay. Yeah, because.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kern, and your lecture was very inspiring. And I would like to ask a question about the 正风. And you have mentioned that the 马王堆五行 echoes the 正风江仲子. And as we all know that 正风 has been seen as 淫邪之淫. And this makes me very curious. And I would like to, may I ask you to share more about your thought of this phenomenon? Do you think about this as some kind of 五行 trying to reinterpret the 正风 or something else? Thank you.
Wu Xing does not actually refer to this Jiang Zhongzi. It's just that when Wu Xing interprets Guanju, it seems to pick up the language from Jiang Zhongzi. Why? I don't know. Now, the question that you raise about Zheng Sheng or Zheng Feng has been a question that has been very uncomfortable for scholars ever since the time of Zhu Xi. And Zhu Xi tried to fix it. And basically, people said, well, you know, 是345写, right? And then Zheng Fengyin, right? And Zheng Shengyin, that's the difference, by the way. Is Zheng Feng the same as Zheng Sheng? That is not at all clear. But people in the Song, in the Southern Song, they thought it was clear. They thought Zheng Feng and Zheng Sheng is the same. And then they said, so how could it be that there is 四五写, there's nothing wrong in the Shijing, and then we have all these wild poems? And then Zhu Xi said, well, they're there as a warning. That was his way out. They're there as a warning. But I think, and we haven't really proceeded much beyond that. I mean, there is, of course, now, when you get to the 20th century, you get to Wu Si. All the Wu Si readings are basically non-historical readings that claim I can read this poem just as it is. I have direct access to it. Here's what Guanju says. It's a marriage poem. It's obvious. There's bells and there's drums and there's music and zithers and, you know, I think that is a fantasy because there is not a single early reading that ever reads it that way. Every time from the very earliest time when we encounter Guofeng poetry, it's always interpreted and not taken literally. But if we read and this is a very peculiar thing to do, if you would sit down and simply read all the Xiaoxu, the minor prefaces. Every poem has its own preface, right? And there's this first short line, and then comes a longer elaboration on that line for every single poem in the Maoshi. Read the 160 Xiaoxu, and you realize that well over 100 are about how to deal with sexual desire. This seems to me the most important question in the whole Shijing, and why it was such an important text, because this goes to the very basic basis of human existence. This is something that every human being can relate to. And this is something, when you want a moral social order, everybody has to deal with. How do you handle desire? Yeah, it's a super fundamental question. You can read most of Xunzi as being about that question. And Xunzi was the most influential philosopher in the Warring States and early Han, by far. Mengzi, 算了吧, nobody cares about Mengzi in the Han. Nobody. Yeah. So I think one function of the Shijing is indeed as a tool for moral education to confront the human condition of desire and the danger of transgression that is always there. And this is what is addressed in poem after poem after poem, and why this text is so central, because the question is so central for society and for each individual. Yeah, moral cultivation. This is, as you saw, both Shangbo and Wu Xing, they don't just say, "Oh, this is 好色." No, they say 以色于礼. And so, in other words, this whole discussion of 正风 or 正位之声, I think is completely misplaced. I think the 正风 is not a random part that needs to be kind of dealt with. Oh, and by the way, it just occurs to me, if you do statistics about which section of the Guofeng is most often recited in Zuozhuan, and you know that Zuozhuan is full of, which section is it? Zhengfeng. It's at the center of poetry recitation in Zuozhuan. Yeah. Is this crazy?
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Yes. One last quick question. Go for it.
About a decade ago, I saw an effort made by a Chinese scholar. He published a book reconstructing the ancient Chu dialect during the Warring States, and his evidence was that the newly discovered Chu manuscript and how their 写生 and 通假 patterns. And I think it is known that in the times as early as Warring State, the writing of Chinese characters is not standardized. So do you kind of recognize this approach to reconstruct dialects based on these patterns? I'm asking this question in English because I want to shed some light on the previous questions asked by the other dude.
He's a professor from Bath.
Thank you for an easy question. The answer is no. I don't believe in that. In fact, to add just one sentence, since the Eastern Han, there have been efforts to identify Chu dialect in the Chuzi, and even that didn't get very far. Japanese scholars have identified about 70 words in all of the Chuzi that they say are Chu dialect. So even there, and if you look at, for example, Li Sao or Jiu Ge or Jiu Zhang, the early parts of the Chuzi, they rhyme exactly like the Shijing. First is Jiu Ge, it's the closest to Shijing rhymes. Second is Li Sao. So no chance. Yeah, but I don't think that we can read that evidence. I mean, I showed you the evidence. When you look at this, I don't think, I mean, you can create your own system and can say, okay, this shows you this or that, but I think it's completely random and arbitrary. And you can set up a system, but you know, the next person says, well, why? I can, right? So no, I have not seen any regularity of that kind when looking at these citations. I don't know, maybe I haven't looked closely, but you might know. Okay, did you hear that? He said even though he is his friend, his work is not well received.
Question times is always limit for such inspiring lectures. As we come to the end of this year's Qianmu lectures, I would like to express our deepest gratitude to Professor Martin Kern for his insightful and thought-provoking lectures. Professor Kern has offered us fresh perspective on all these ancient Chinese text classics and their relevance within the historical context of the early stage. We are truly privileged to have witnessed the unveiling of these invaluable insights into the literature and culture of early China. On behalf of the college, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to all of you who have contributed to the success of the event, and to each and every one of you for being a part of this engaging intellectual journey. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kern and Professor Zheng, for this inspiring lecture. And thank you all again for coming. So before you leave, please help us to fill out the questionnaire by scanning the QR code on the screen. And also we have another questionnaire available at the booklet, which is in yellow. So thank you very much and have a nice day.